Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this event titled America 250 Years, the Ongoing Struggle for Democracy and Equal Rights. This event was organized by Marxist Unity Group, which is a caucus within the DSA that fights for a democratic republic, socialism, and programmatic unity. And my name's Luke. I'm going to be facilitating tonight's conversation. I'm very happy to introduce Aziz Rana. Aziz is a professor of constitutional law. He's an educator, and he's the author of two books, The Two Faces of American Freedom and The Constitutional Bind. Aziz has made multiple appearances on DSA's podcast, Class. And Aziz, you recently spoke with Oliver Larkin and Richie Floyd at a National Electoral Commission or an NEC event, which was titled For Peace, Democracy, and Socialism. I was also just saying you just the other day did a discussion with Boston Review about some of the things that we'll talk about today. So you're staying busy with this stuff. Marxist Unity Group, we really wanted to highlight your work, Aziz, especially as it relates to the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and as the event title says, the ongoing struggle for democracy and equal rights. So, Aziz, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on for that very kind introduction. Thanks to you and Marin and everybody else for putting this together. And for all of you for showing up virtually on a Wednesday evening.
So I'll pose the first question to you here, Aziz. This year is, well, I should say, in 3 days, we have the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. How can we contextualize the signing of the Declaration, and how could we understand 1776 more broadly?
So the title for my first book was The Two Faces of American Freedom. And I think that doubleness is a good way of thinking about the meaning of the revolution. So that as both an embodiment of an idea of freedom and as sustaining a set of practices that are profoundly subordinating. And it's important to be able to hold both of them at the same time in thinking through the legacy. So, on the one hand, I think it's really important to just say that the Declaration and the Revolution was part of a series of revolutions at the end of the 18th century. So there's the American Revolution, but there's also the French and the Haitian revolutions. And all of these together are really initiating a profoundly new era in like the history of the world, which is this idea that if faced with oppressive forms of government, even distant imperial regimes, that collectives, people have the capacity to organize and throw off oppressive government and replace those oppressive governments with forms of order consistent with their own ideas of self-rule, political participation, of economic independence. And that's, I think, a really important sort of like feature of the revolutionary project and something that's actually like worth holding on to and worth recognizing the ways in which the American Revolution is part of this long then tradition of revolutionary politics built around the idea of the capacity for change, the dynamic potential of people, and this basic principle of popular sovereignty and consent of the governed. At the same time, it's also really critical to hold firm to, well, what was the kind of society that Euro-American settlers were seeking to create? And first and foremost, it has to be said that the settlers that came from England, they had a particular idea of self-government for themselves, but they also understood the conditions, like the structural conditions for their own internal freedom to be access to Native American land to provide the basis for economic independence. So Native American expropriation and conquest, and then also for themselves to enjoy something like free labor, control over work. There would have to be folks that engaged in hard, coerced forms of labor. And they addressed that problem over time through the enslavement of Black people in particular, and then justify that on racial grounds. And so it wasn't just like there are these contradictory values, a commitment to self-determination, and at the same time, its limitation through native expropriation or the enslavement of Black people. These things were structurally, intricately linked in the construction of the society. And so what that means is that for us in the 21st century, to reflect on the sort of inheritance from the revolution. It's both an inheritance that connects, let's say, the US to Haiti to anti-colonial projects in the 20th century, this idea that you can cast off oppressive forms of government. But it's also an inheritance that sustains the US as a very specific kind of society committed to forms of imperial expansion. And that second element is something that has to be fundamentally repudiated for any account of equal and effective freedom for all to actually be achieved. So that's the way in which freedom and subordination are laced together for us to grapple with today.
I appreciate that rundown, especially seeing the US Revolution as part of a longer process, if you will. It's part of something that's continuing on. Folks will talk about the Atlantic revolutions, for example, putting the US Revolution in conversation with the French Revolution, as you said, with the Haitian Revolution, the liberation of the areas under Spanish control and the rest of Latin America. So contextualizing it, and then also, of course, looking at what's going on within the North American content.
Yeah, and this is just as like an additional thought on this. It's part of why so much of the celebrations of the revolution are misplaced. And I'm sure that we'll get a chance to talk about this, but there's this tendency to combine 1776 with 1787 with the institutions of like state established with the new federal constitution, and then to deify framers, founders, the founding generation. Where actually, if we were thinking about like, well, what is the inheritance worth defending? The inheritance is the same inheritance that radicals across the centuries have held on to, from Black abolitionists like David Walker to socialists like Debs to folks in the Panthers like Huey Newton, which is this idea that a people facing oppression can cast off their oppressors and reconstruct their own society, that a society is ultimately susceptible to the intervention of an evolving and changing people. Now that's a radical thing that's worth defending. But what is the thing that essentially gets venerated instead? It's the specific sort of institutional forms, the ideas of the framers, the founders themselves. And it's precisely their institutional legacy that is the thing that's basically been a vice grip for us, that's been like a profound trap for our own capacities now to engage in various forms of democracy. So that on the one hand, the thing that's worth defending, like the revolutionary possibility of politics, that's repudiated. And the thing that ends up being venerated, precisely the legacies of that founding generation, the ideas, the desire to go back to like the original philosophies of, Madison and Enslaver or Hamilton or whomever else. That's exactly the kind of thinking that essentially limits our own political capacities today and then ends up undermining our ability to think about the prospective potential for change.
I personally see the values of the Declaration, this idea of universal and equal rights, and a few others that are expressed in that, as standing in contradiction to what we get with the Constitution. And it's been used, as I'm going to ask here, those values of the Declaration. It's been invoked, usually by many by progressive movements, in order to draw a contrast or to point out a contrast or a contradiction between what currently exists. So, for example, the 19th century women's rights movement in the United States, they brought in the Declaration of Independence to say, you know, why not women? Why aren't women involved in this equality? The abolitionists, socialists as well, the Socialist Party of America, national independence leaders, Black Power movements, they all engaged with the Declaration. So could you reflect on how the Declaration has been used since 1776, and if there's anything about that stands out to you?
It's worth highlighting the ways in which 1776 and 1787 are similar and then like the profound difference. So one way in which I do think it's appropriate to show a connection is that the Declaration of Independence has this language about self-determination that's, really significant, not just for American history, but as a way of thinking about global history and the global history of democratic revolution. But it also then lists a series of grievances and it builds to a crescendo. And the very last grievance is basically an accusation that the English crown, as many folks are probably familiar with, has invited insurrections, revolts by enslaved persons. So, for instance, the fact that Lord Dunmore, in the context of Virginia, was willing to provide emancipation to enslaved Black workers that would take up arms against the U.S. And then also one of the um, one of the arguments that's presented as a list of grievance, so like the very final reference, is about Native peoples and the role of the English in essentially undermining the capacity of the settler colonists to expand. And in this way, I think it's important to still recognize that for all the democratic potential, the revolution is a revolt of settlers against both the English crown and against native persons and various other communities that were on the ground at the time. Now, in that way, there's a clear link to the Constitution, which is the Constitution is also a set of institutions that's established by settlers who are navigating this question of how do you actually produce substantive independence for these now sort of like newly independent colonies on the Eastern Seaboard that are relatively weak by comparison with European empire, with European powers. Like, how do you produce substantive independence? How do you create the conditions of a form of government that can allow for territorial expansion, for economic growth? And so the kinds of concerns that generate elements of the Declaration are present in the types of concerns among certain elite settlers that produces the federal Constitution. So these two things have that kind of link. Nonetheless, I think there's a really profound difference, which is that 1776 is a moment of eruptive little d democracy for sort of settlers on insiders that are members of these communities. So like it creates the space for small scale settler democracies that are built around farmers that produce, for instance, governmental forms that even have unicameral legislatures that are thinking about providing broad access to paper money to be free from debt relief, so that there's a kind of not middle class or working class, but sort of middling class yeoman and sort of small scale, small property holder that's being elevated in that moment. And then the Constitution establishes a set of institutions that in many ways views precisely that type of eruptive politics of the many as a threat to the country's long-term success and independence, and so establishes institutions that treat the tyranny of the majority and the kind of power that people that are propertyless and landless have as perhaps the central kind of threat that could undermine the viability of an established government. And so you have very clearly a 1787 moment, and this is why you have all of these veto points. You have a system that really compromises the capacity of the legislative branch, which was viewed as the most dangerous branch to assert authority. So you have a constitutional order that in this way is a constraint on what some elites viewed as the excess of democracy. And this, I think, creates a type of tension that you can see play out across American history, where when I think about the productive, in my view, uses of the revolutionary tradition and the reason why you have abolitionists and feminists and socialists invoking the revolution and the Declaration is precisely because it doesn't specify the institutional form and instead asserts this right of revolution in the context of political orders, economic orders that undermine the capacity of individuals and groups to enjoy something like equal and effective freedom. And so it is an invocation to eruptive change on behalf of a principle of justice and liberation. And this is why, when you think about, for instance, socialists in the early 20th century, they invoke the Declaration but then they reject the Constitution. And the reason why they're rejecting the Constitution is because the Constitution establishes a set of concrete institutional forms that are inconsistent with this democratic capacity of the oppressed effectively to assert their own will and interests. So there's this one tradition of invoking the Declaration in a way in contrast to the Constitution that's about the kind of open, dynamic capacity of a people to have their rights respected and to transform society in ways that are keeping with their own ends. But at the same time, there's this other approach. And you can think of this as conservative, or you can see it in political centrism, the long history of, let's say, Cold War liberalism, that collapses the Declaration and the Constitution, that treats the two as the same, and invokes the Declaration not for its transformative potential ultimately, but as a way of saying that the US in the 18th century basically solved the problem of politics, created something like a near perfect set of institutions, and that the condition of the present or the project of the present is to hew as close as possible to what those institutions established. And in this way, to take what is a politics of revolution, what is 1776, but like a revolutionary moment that's deeply unruly, and turn it instead into a language of order and stability. Take a set of principles that could be applied to critique society and transform society into a mechanism for legitimating the established forms of state and economy. And these are two long strands or traditions that we can see play out. Now, I've given it in a stylized way. There are folks that combine the two, there's complexities to it, but that's like the long running trajectory in my view.
There are many people who are talking about this stuff right now. And to note that these points that you're making are being spread, are being talked about. There's a historian, for example, Tad Stormer, who talks a lot about resistance history, and he's really frustrated with how, yes, this history of unruliness gets repackaged back, and suddenly, to be American means to be orderly or to follow the rules. And just today, actually, in Jacobin, Doug Henwood had an article called "The Founders Never Meant the U.S. to be a Democracy." He was talking about 1787 and the issues with the existing Constitution.
Highlighting these two different orientations that you can take to the legacy is the legacy about venerating um, a set of perceived near completed achievements that now have to be preserved? Or is it about the potential for self determination and renewal? I mean, it's significant for a lot of different reasons. It's significant, one, obviously, because we live in a moment where I think the question of the present is in a context of extreme crises. To what extent can Americans collectively actually alter the conditions of their own society? Can they engage in practices of we the people and self determination? Like, that's, I think, a big question for the present. But then it's also, I think, important if we're thinking about that history for understanding in a sense like, well, what is the US's relationship ultimately to the rest of the world, to native peoples that it shared the same territorial landmass with, North America, to independence movements in like across the global south. And to the extent that you emphasize the idea that the principle to extract is a principle of self-determination, then this is something that can be held alongside, for instance, a respect for Native American self determination, for self determination of the global South, alongside a principle of anti imperialism. But to the extent that you de emphasize it and focus instead on the institutional legacies, the genius of the Constitution, or the idea that what the Declaration highlights is that the US has always been nearly perfect as a society of liberty and equality, then inevitably what you're going to do is you're going to erase the US's embeddedness in histories of colonialism, both settler colonialism in North America and then like global colonialism more generally. And in that sense, you're just going to replicate again precisely some of the destructive features of how the revolutionary legacy has sort of been reproduced over time.
Well, it's that point of erasure or forgetting that's such an important part of your book, The Constitutional Bind. I was going back through some of the chapters in preparation for this, chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, that sort of section of the book, because we don't know much about how these folks used the Declaration of Independence, these progressive movements that I talked about, but we especially don't know how these folks used these values, oftentimes, just as you were saying, explicitly against the constitutional system. And that process of sort of how that was forgotten leaves out the intentional aspect, perhaps, of some of this project. Um, but I think that that's an important part, the forgetting or the going underground of these ideas that we're talking about, and then the return of them, perhaps.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That if we were having this conversation or a version of this 100 years ago, it would have been a commonplace position on the American left. So especially the labor left, but the black political left as well, to say, you know, the Declaration and the Constitution are fundamentally separate projects, and actually probably to fulfill some of the democratic aspirations that one might see embedded in the Declaration, you're going to have a very different kind of constitutional order. And that would not have been a strange thing to say at all, because perhaps like the dominant or one of the most significant narratives of the Constitution that came out of the historian Charles Beard, but not just Charles Beard, a whole host of writers that are part of progressive era historiography, would have been the argument that the Constitution was a counter revolutionary document and was organized to a set of class interests, not an unfamiliar position. The thing that really happens in the mid 20th century is the transformation of this conversation, such that, on the one hand, the only way you can talk about the idea of constitutionalism was through the American model. And that these socialist critiques that were basically critiques on behalf of civil liberties, on behalf of civil rights, on behalf of a democratically organized state, that socialism writ large became reduced to a set of caricatured ideas associated with the US's Cold War confrontation with the Soviet Union that almost definitionally rejected constitutional principle, constitutional liberty, the idea of constitutional government, and that the US's form, the Madisonian form, was the only way that you could imagine constitutionalism. And that has had such a long legacy that even today, even at a moment like the one that we're living through, where there's a lot of open and forthright criticism of our constitutional system, it can still be very difficult for people to recognize the way in which a commitment to democratic self determination and even a commitment to little c constitutionalism, the idea that there should be some checks or limits on political power, need not require defending the big C Constitution of Madison, Hamilton, and the framers. Like those things just get completely interconnected in a story that, even more generally, is really one that then reinvests with the founders all of the achievements across American history that folks might want to hold on to, including achievements that are really 20th century achievements that have very little to do with an 18th and 19th century regional settler colonial polity.
I think in a previous discussion, you used, for example, the word sort of the phrase rhetorical hooks to describe how some of our some of our rights, one might say, our inherent human rights, find a home in the Constitution through the Bill of Rights, which was not something that the framers gladly included in the document. And yet, one of the challenges today of talking with people about the need to change the Constitution, not a challenge with everyone, but one encounters it, is this action of, but what about my rights? What about my civil rights? So your point about how these things get mushed together, and part of this is pulling them apart in a way. And history, a history lesson can do that, I suppose. I wanted to linger on the idea of universal and equal rights and bring in the Constitution. You've argued that the current Constitution does not embody the principle of one person, one vote. In fact, I think in the book you use the word flagrant, something like it flagrantly violates that principle, or you can't hold that principle one person, one vote in mind, look at the Constitution and go, these things are compatible. So folks might be relatively familiar with why that's the case, why the Constitution is in conflict with this idea of one person, one vote. I was curious if you could go into that a little bit. But I was more curious why you use that particular phrase, why you want to bring that particular phrase into the conversation.
Yeah. So, I mean, the problem that's probably familiar to folks that are part of the conversation today is that the U.S. Constitution is not premised on what we think of as sort of like the basic foundation of democratic representation, which is decisions should be made as a result of like what the majority in a society would would commit to. That instead, representation is built around geography, and it's built around geography as a way of resolving late 18th century problems about the fact that the United States was a coming together of these distinct English colonies into a single political, uh, a single polity or political unit. And as a result, the colonies became states, and states ended up being the basic unit of representation. And it's continued to be the basic unit of representation all the way to the present in ways that have massively deleterious effects. So we know this with the Electoral College, with the Senate, with the role of state legislatures in shaping state electoral rules and processes, so gerrymandering, with the reconstruction of the Supreme Court through precisely the fact that the appointment and nomination process runs through the president and Senate, and on and on and on and on. So we've ended up with a set of institutions as a result that are profoundly undemocratic because they dramatically overrepresent small population centers that are the site of the power of like the far right. And in the process also then really incentivize the right to effectively like defect from what we think of as the basic principles and institutions of multiracial democracy. So this is the problem. I end up invoking this idea of one person, one vote because that phrase has a very specific 20th century history. Again, it has a history that's global, it has a history that's domestic to the US. The global history is that if you're in, in a in a colony in Asia or Africa, oftentimes the construction of those colonies were sort of built around these arcane um, electoral arrangements with mediated forms of representation that was shaped by interests back in the metropole home country, the imperial center. And one of the things that folks argued for on the ground was we should enjoy the basic premises of representation. Like our consent should shape politics. And the way that our consent shapes politics is if we have electoral rules that are not through this intricate arrangement that ensures that the imperial home country gets to have all the authority, but instead, if our electoral arrangements are based on the principle of one person, one vote, every single person in the colony gets to make decisions, and then ultimately that's a foundation for self-determination and self-government. That's an international story. And then there's a domestic story where that becomes pretty central too, to how Black Americans talk about the problems of white authoritarianism that shaped the US, with the defeat of Reconstruction, through the Jim Crow period, and all the way up through the 1960s, where the US has a set of electoral arrangements that just very simply denies the ability of all to enjoy the capacity to participate in the most basic functionings of government and denies the principle of one person, one vote. And that even ends up having a kind of legal significance through Supreme Court debates in the 1960s that are the product of civil rights activism. So this is the reason why I invoke the principle. Not because I necessarily think of it as a sufficient condition for equal and effective freedom for all or for socialist democracy, but it's a kind of bare bones baseline for anything like a functional democracy, representative set of representative institutions that the US has really primarily basically like just failed to achieve. And so it's a way of highlighting the limitations of the representative institutions in the United States and the extent to which, even in the 20th and 21st centuries, the US basically remained out of step with where most representative systems of government ended up going.
There's a lot there. Just one, that story, which I recently really understood after reading a book about it, of how uh, legislative districts within state legislatures, and then eventually I believe there was a ruling that applied it to the federal House districts, how those were made more or less representative during the 1960s, and how just dramatically unrepresentative they were prior to that, mostly because people just weren't redistricting or weren't redrawing. Yeah, weren't redistricting. Is quite something.
There's a kind of remarkable case from the 60s that's very closely associated with the establishment of the constitutional fundamental right to vote. So the right to vote, because of the fact that we have a constitution from the 18th century, incredibly hard to amend, is not actually formally stipulated in the text of the Constitution, but has sort of emerged through interpretation over time. But the case has to do, one of the cases that really highlights this right has to do with a potential effort in Alabama to establish a Senate. So for a state Senate that is organized geographically, just like the US, like the federal Constitution Senate. And what the court, at this sort of high tide of the civil rights revolution, the transformations in who's on the court, what the court says is, well, that's actually inconsistent with the right to vote because it's built on geography, not on the principle of one person, one vote. Now, of course, that raises this really profound question, which is the fact that the Supreme Court is saying that Alabama, rightly, because Alabama is considering this as a way of really undermining black voting within the state, but that this potential is inconsistent with principles of democracy and representative government, and yet the entire constitutional order, the federal constitution, is built precisely around the idea that you could have an upper chamber that is premised on geography and not on representation that's popular representation.
I think it was a bit of propaganda produced by a group of folks who were against the reapportionment, the making equal of these legislative districts in the states. They made a big poster that imagined how the Senate would look like if there was equal representation, to say, warning, warning, what if this principle gets applied equally? And of course, it was never going to do that. The Supreme Court justices made a point of saying, we're not going to apply this to the Senate. But
Yeah, and the argument that
really
they made
interesting.
was that the Constitution formally stipulates the terms of the Senate, and so like those formal stipulations insulate the Senate in a way that state legislative practices are not insulated. But I think it raises this very profound question about just the nature of representation in the US. And, this is part of why, if we just look over the last half century to really 75 years since World War II, and certainly since the era of decolonization in the 60s and 70s, that the US is absolutely an outlier when it comes to how it structured its legal and electoral arrangements. Like that, there's no country that follows the US approach because it's seen as pretty wildly out of step with precisely this idea that everyone should have an equal vote.
I want to turn to DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. It's a nationwide organization dedicated to fighting for democracy and socialism. And our previous program, our previous Workers Deserve More program, talked about putting, and here I quote, putting workers in charge of the government through a new democratic constitution that establishes civil, political, and democratic rights for all, is based on proportional representation in a single federal legislature, and ends the role of money in politics. End quote. Our updated program, which I think is soon to be released maybe at the end of this month, calls for the abolition of the Senate and the replacement of the president and the Supreme Court with an executive and judiciary chosen by and subordinate to Congress. I think those are more or less the exact words. Could you do two things for us? Both reflect on these programmatic statements and also do that in terms of their importance and their history within, and as we've been talking about the long absence of their presence within how socialists have talked about the Constitution. And I'll pause just one moment. I remember when I read your book, um, The Constitutional Bind, for the first time, it was remarkable where you cite, I believe, twice what was then DSA's 2021 program and put that in conversation with the Socialist Party of America. So I had all that going on in my head. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. So without going through a kind of like detailed assessment of both what might have been the earlier program and the shifts now, I think, I'd broadly say that this strikes me as incredibly important. That, you know, in simplest terms, it's basically about moving the US legal and political institutions into something that looks more like what we see as representative forms of government elsewhere. So it's not really necessarily an achievement of socialism per se, but it's the production of a system of government that's more compatible with multiracial democracy that looks like parliamentary mass democracy. And I think it's like an important initial step. And it's an important initial step for the same reason that socialists in the past turned to shifts to the legal and electoral system, which is that they recognized that there was no real divide between what you can think of as substance and process. Substance being the replacement of capitalism with a far more humane system of economic control and economic distribution. There's no distinction between that and like process, namely the set of representative or electoral arrangements that can facilitate or assist that shift. Because the rules of the political game end up placing massive potential constraints on the kinds of substantive achievements that you might want to pursue. And so you have to effectively think seriously about how to democratize those rules, even if ultimately what you're interested in has very little to do with the politics of elections or parliamentarism. Let's say what you most are concerned about is what we can think of as like bread and butter questions of the workplace democracy. Well, if you operate within a legal environment that is incredibly hostile to labor like we do right now, and to pass any kind of law that substantially improves the position of unions and of labor requires making it through these representative electoral institutions, and that's foreclosed, then that's going to necessarily mean that even your efforts at direct action are operating effectively with one arm behind your back. That you have to have a political constitutional agenda so as to shift the rules in ways that make the other kinds of transformative ambitions that you're interested in pursuing more feasible. And that these two things are profoundly interlinked. And so that was the reason why socialists made this a centerpiece of their reform agenda in the first third of the 20th century. And I think it's a central reason why it has to be now. I just add one additional thing, and maybe this is, I don't know if it's a caveat or it's a way of um, making a bit more complex the conversation we just had about one person, one vote. I think in thinking about the reforms that DSA or that reformers should pursue, that it's really important to kind of recognize the types of injustice that our current constitutional order generates at different levels of government. So the thing that's striking about the US constitutional system, because it's a federal system, is it constitutionalizes the state. as this unit between what we can think of as like totally decentralized local authority and the national government. So the state has real constitutional power. It shapes the terms of representation. It ends up determining even the construction of um, House districts, the one space within the national system that's supposed to be premised just on pure majority rule. And what this has done is it actually produces what you can think of as minority tyranny at the national level, and then a very particular kind of racialized majority tyranny at the state level. What do I mean by this? At the national level, what this has done is it undermines the ability of multiracial democracies, even if they have majority support, to be able to exercise the institutions of power. And that instead it dramatically elevates the authority of a minority coalition that's demographically, culturally, economically quite limited. So it like produces the type of control that somebody like Trump and the people around Trump are able to assert at the national level. And at the state level, it does something that's comparable but distinct, which is if you take, for example, like a state like Alabama, if we're thinking about these states have demographies that have a white majority and a black minority. But the state is able to construct through first the past the post approaches, subconstitutional practices, gerrymandering, electoral arrangements that mean that a black minority are systematically denied political representation. And that itself is a form of majority tyranny at the state level that is a product of how electoral rules are constructed. And what ends up happening is so that you don't have elections that are conjunctural where majorities shift over time, they're demographic majorities, white conservative majorities, that are able to entrench themselves permanently through these state electoral rules. And the way that that intersects with the politics at the national level produces truly a worst of both worlds, where you have white, conservative, and really authoritarian demographic majorities that use state power to then dominate national government in ways that essentially violate the principle, not just of one person, one vote, but like that undermine the capacity of a multiracial majority that's more representative of the country as a whole to be able to have their interests met. And so it means that any ultimate like response as a set of constitutional shifts or reforms to represented institutions shouldn't be thinking in terms of, well, the problem is counter-majoritarianism or the problem is majoritarianism. It's instead looking at where is it that we see minority tyranny? Where is it that we see majority tyranny? And how could you create a set of overlapping institutions that would actually facilitate the capacity of all constituencies to have their interests met? And so, for instance, at the state level, like one of the ways to think about this is if you move to multi-member districts would actually create the conditions by which you'd be able to break up some of these like permanent fixed demographic majorities that white conservatives and white authoritarians have been able to take advantage of. And so that you want to have pretty profound changes to the construction of electoral politics at the state level, or rethinking even the concept of the state alongside how that then has these interplays with politics at the national level.
We're bringing in the states and the power of states. Again, that's a whole thing. It makes me think of this discussion that flared up, I don't know, maybe a few days ago. Goodness knows, the news cycle moves so quickly around mail-in voting, and whether or not Trump was going to be able to set the rules around who would receive ballots in the mail. And it became then this conversation of, well, states should, and well, ultimately it was affirmed would be able to control the voting process, seen as at least in some sections, sort of a protection against the overreach of Trump. But if we stay sort of trapped in that conversation of states' rights, protecting us from the Trump administration, it misses, I would imagine, just exactly what you're talking about in terms
Yeah.
of all problems at the state level.
So I mean, uh, just very briefly, like I think one of the false sort of paths that the Trump's return has ended up sort of bringing to the foreground is this idea that, oh, maybe actually a kind of progressive federalism is the solution. Isn't it great that you can have attorneys general at the state level in blue states really put pressure on the Trump administration, and that you could imagine various solutions at the state level? The way that I would approach this is like, I think this is actually really important. It's important to bring the lawsuits. It's important to experiment with democratic alternatives in the institutional spaces where folks actually have power. And certainly at the local level, the rise of municipal socialism and the DSA strength, these are all like wonderful developments, really important developments. But one should nonetheless understand that this is taking advantage of a hostile institutional terrain. And that, like, ultimately, the solution is not going to be through, cobbling together power among a majority or near majority of states, but it's going to be creating the conditions whereby you can actually transform the basic units of representation. That we're precisely in this dilemma because of the role that states have in kind of constricting the terms of American politics. And so one cannot assume just because, yes, there's the potential to take advantage of the tools that are opened up in this sort of like second or third or near worst case scenario, that therefore that's a legitimation or a justification for keeping things more or less as they are.